Come on in, honey. The lantern's lit, the veil's a little thin, and the wind's been dying to carry a few secrets your way. Welcome to Raven's Ramblings, where the shadows walk beside us and the past never stays buried, and a good spell can speak louder than a sermon. I'm Raven Nightingale, part healer, part hellraiser, keeper of the old ways and ghost stories alike. So pull up a chair and listen close. You never know what might be whispering in the dark. Hello, my witchy friends. Welcome back to Raven's Ramblings. I'm your host, Raven, and as always, I'm so glad you're here. So, I don't know about y'all, but Mercury retrograde has been kicking everyone's ass this time. It's been rough. I know. So just wanted to throw that out there and go, hey, hopefully you're not suffering as much as we've been, but if you are, right there with you, babe. Right there with you. Okay, so I want to talk to you about, I want to tell you about this rabbit hole that I kind of fell into the other night. So I've been doing witchcraft for 20, yeah, 1900s. We'll just start with the 1900s for a long time, right? And so what had happened was it was one of those moments where I started kind of researching one thing, and then 2 hours later, I'm kinda sitting there and go, "Well, shit, I've been kinda wrong about this for years." Not like not like completely wrong about something, but just kinda missing an important, very interesting part of the story. So you know how social media works, right? You watch a video on herbs and then another one on candles and then somebody's making a prosperity spell jar and before you know it you've completely forgotten what you were originally looking up, and that's kind of what happened to me. Not that that's unusual because I do tend to jump a little bit. I'm a little yeah. So I wasn't even trying to research witch bottles. I was actually looking at spell jars, but because let's be honest, spell jars are everywhere now. Pinterest is full of them, TikTok is full of them, Instagram, YouTube, Etsy. I mean, they are everywhere because if you type witchcraft into a search bar, I would almost guarantee, I would almost bet a kidney on one of the first things that you're going to see is someone layering herbs in a little glass bottle, tying this really pretty ribbon around it, and dripping some colored wax over the cork and holding it up to the camera. And honestly, y'all know I love a good. My AC is going to kick on. We're going to see how this rolls. I love a good spell jar. I use spell jars all the time. I make them. I still make them. I made one last week. There, like I said, there are a few sitting around my house and in my freezer right now. One's actually out on my back porch, so the sun can beat down on it and kind of ferment everything. But anyway, so this episode is not me saying that we've been doing it all wrong. Not even a little bit. Okay, because we're not, because it's your witchcraft. You do it how you feel is right, right? But somewhere in the middle of all of that scrolling the other night, my brain asked a question, where did this actually come from? Not where did I learn it or where TikTok learned it, but where did it actually start? You know, because traditions, no matter how long they've been going on, had to start somewhere. Someone had to have that idea first. And that's where things got a little bit interesting. Because if you would have asked me a month ago, or hell, well, yeah, it's been about a month. If you would have asked me a month ago what a witch bottle was, I would have said, well, it's basically an old fashioned spell jar. Makes sense, right? Turns out, not really. They're not really the same. They're cousins, maybe even like grandparents and grandchildren kind of thing. Like there is a connection, but they are not the same thing, right? And learning the difference honestly made me kind of appreciate both of them more. Because, I mean, I don't know about y'all, but when I learn something new, I do tend to appreciate the simpler things that I've been doing one way for years and years and go, oh, that's why. That kind of thing. Now, before we get into like the rusty nails and the creepy old bottles hidden inside the walls, of course, you should have known that's where we were headed with all this. Let's talk about the spell jars that most of us know about today. Yeah, because here's the great thing about witchcraft. If you ask 10 different witches what goes into a spell jar, you're probably going to get bare minimum 10 different answers. Okay. And some of those people have two or three different ways of doing those particular spell jars. So you may even get more than 10. Some people use herbs, some use crystals, some write petitions down or add sigils or use colored wax. Some don't seal them at all. Some people do bury them. Some of them are kept on altars. I was trying to see if I had one on my altar. I don't. It's on my bookshelf here, but that's a whole different thing. Some carry tiny ones in their purse. I actually have one in my car. It's a little tiny protection spell jar. I have one in my car and in my wife's car. Yeah. And none of those things are wrong. Okay. And that's actually one of the things I really do love about modern witchcraft. It is very flexible. It is very personal. It is very creative. We are allowed to adapt things and experiment and make things our own. Okay. We're allowed to say, this works for me, even if it doesn't look exactly like somebody else's practice. Right. And I think personally that is amazing. It is beautiful. It really does make each one's craft very personal to them. And I love that. But here's the but. Here's the but. Something I've noticed is sometimes, especially online, social media, it's amazing and terrible all at the same time. We have had that discussion last week. Sometimes we can kind of get caught up in making our magic look like someone else's magic that, and or even that we're just trying to make it look magical, but we forget to ask why we do what we do. And I'm guilty of that. I mean, and maybe I learned it somewhere back in the day and forgot, but here I am learning again this many years into the craft about the difference between an actual witch bottle and an actual spell bottle, right? So there's always room for learning. And I see I'll see like this gorgeous spell jar with like dried flowers and maybe some moss and an amethyst crystal and this beautiful purple dripped wax on it. And my first thought of seeing something like that is, well, that's pretty. Not, where did this tradition come from? Because those are two completely different questions. One is about aesthetics. We all love a good aesthetic. The other is about history. Okay. And history is important. It is messy and weird, and it is very rarely Pinterest worthy, which brings us back to witch bottles. Now, when I first heard the term witch bottle, I made what I think is a pretty reasonable assumption. I figured that witches made them. I mean, it's literally called a witch bottle. Seems obvious, right? Except historically, most of the witch bottles that we've found weren't actually made by witches at all. Right? That totally surprised me too. I was like, but that's what it's called. But whatever. Anyway, most most historians believe that they were made just by ordinary people who thought they had been cursed or hexed or targeted by some kind of harmful magic. These were not people that were trying to cast a spell. They were trying to stop one. And all of a sudden, everything after reading through that made a whole lot more sense to me. Because you really think about it. You live, let's say, in a tiny English village 400 years ago. There were no security cameras, alarm systems, there were no antibiotics. And if something terrible happened, like your cow suddenly got sick or your child developed a fever, your crops failed, sometimes people looked for explanations they could understand. And they were also very superstitious people. Yeah. And whether we agree with those beliefs today isn't the point. All right. The people wanted to protect the people that they loved. And that really hasn't changed. We still do that. We just do it a little bit differently by, locking doors, cameras, vaccinating, seatbelts, that kind of stuff. All right. So every generation has had its way of saying, I want my family to be safe. Right. Well, for some people in the 1500s, that safety included a strange little bottle that was buried under the fireplace, right? Super fun. Now, here's where things get wonderfully weird. Because if you're picturing these beautiful little corked bottles with lavender and rose petals, well, you might just want to let that image go. Just let it on go, honey. This is not Pinterest. These bottles were gross. Seriously, they really were gross. And honestly, some people still use these practices today. So when archaeologists started finding witch bottles that were hidden inside these old houses in England, they opened them expecting probably herbs, ashes, that kind of stuff. Instead, they found things like rusty nails and bent pins and broken glass and fish hooks and thorns and hair. Some even had like fingernail clippings or even little scraps of fabric. And most of them had a liquid to them also. Y'all know what it was. It was pee. It was pee. And apparently human urine showed up in a lot of these witch bottles. Now, before we go any further, this is not me telling you to go pee in a mason jar. Please don't email me about that. Please don't. I mean, look, if that's what you want to do, honey, you do you, boo. But I'm not telling you you have to do that. All right. But there was an actual reason for it, for them to put their urine in these protection type jars. And as strange as it sounds today, people believed that using their own urine kind of created a magical connection between themselves and that bottle, kind of like a tag lock, right? Like when we do a spell, or when I do a spell jar today, if it's for someone specific, then I'm going to put some kind of tag lock in it. So if you are building a protection bottle, especially then, you want it to protect you and yours, you put something of yourself in there, like the fingernail clippings or the urine, right? Yeah. Because the bottle wasn't just holding random objects. It was standing in for the person that it was protecting. And once I really thought about it, it didn't sound as bizarre. Still kind of gross, but way less random. Like the nails and pins and broken glass. Those weren't just things that somebody swept up off the floor. The sharp objects were believed to trap or pierce or confuse whatever harmful magic has been sent toward that person. Now, I still use rusty nails and broken things in my spell jars now. So that totally made sense. And it was almost like, imagine building a magical mousetrap, not to catch a mouse, but to catch a curse or a hex or bad energy, right? And whether you believe that actually worked isn't really what fascinates me about the whole process. What really fascinates me is the creativity about it, you know? Like me using nails in my jars, that had to come from somewhere, and it came from things like this. People looked around at ordinary objects like nails and pins and the stoneware bottles, and it was just things they already had. And they turned them into protection items. Yeah. Feels pretty familiar, right? Yeah. Because that's kind of what we still do. Maybe instead of rusty nails, you're using rosemary Or instead of a beautiful stoneware, handmade stoneware bottle, you're using one of those little tiny glass jars we get from the Dollar Tree. I use a lot of those. But we're still talking about ordinary things and filling them with extraordinary meaning. Yeah? And you know what's really funny about it to me? The more that I read about these old witch bottles, and the more I realized that they weren't meant to be found. You know what I mean? Like they were not meant to come out from under that fireplace or come out of that wall. Yeah? Yeah. Because think about it. The archaeologists were not discovering these over the years sitting out on a mantle somewhere. No one had them displayed beside a candle and a crystal. No one was showing this to visitors, right? They were hidden under the hearthstones or beneath doorways or under the floor, in the walls. They stayed hidden for hundreds of years, you know? Sometimes they were even tucked into places where no one would ever even think to look unless the house was being torn apart. And I really kind of love that because today we tend to think that if something is magical, it should be visible because we build beautiful altars and we decorate them and we put those pictures online. We share our rituals and of course there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I personally love seeing everyone's creativity. But these old folk practitioners, their attitude was more like if it's doing its job, why would anyone else need to see it, right? I do have some spell jars that no one ever sees. Those are very special ones. They I don't want anyone else's energy to contaminate it or the energy from that jar to contaminate someone who it's not meant for, kind of thing. Right? So I get that part. And it's pretty refreshing once you think about it. Because it really does remind me that traditionally, uh, every piece of magic doesn't need an audience, right? Some of the most meaningful things that we do are in complete privacy. Maybe it is stirring your morning coffee with intention before you go to work. Or maybe it's touching the charm that hangs from your rearview mirror before you walk into a difficult shift. Maybe it's whispering a blessing over your garden when no one else is around. Nobody has to know those things. It doesn't make the magic any less real. It makes it more personal. Yeah. And another thing about the older witch bottles that fascinates me is where people hid these bottles. Things like the fireplaces and the doorways and the thresholds. These were not random choices. Those places have been considered very special in different cultures all over the world. Like, think about your front door. It's that kind of in between place. Outside becomes the inside, or the inside becomes the outside, or a stranger becomes a guest. The outside world ends and your home begins, right? You never thought about your front door like that. It's a pretty powerful idea, though, when you really stop and think about it. So it makes sense that if someone wanted to protect their family, they would put that protection at the place where everything enters their home. And it's almost like saying, you can come in, but anything that wishes us harm stops right the fuck here. Yeah. And then there's the fireplace. Now, obviously, most of us are not cooking over an open hearth anymore, especially right now because it's Louisiana and it is hot as balls. I'm trying to cook as little as possible, right? But if you do cook over an open hearth, that's fabulous. Send me pictures. I would love to see that because that's pretty badass, right? But for centuries, the hearth wasn't just where dinner was made. It was the true center of the home. It provided warmth and light, and that's where the families would gather. Stories were told there. Babies were rocked to sleep nearby. You know, People took their final breaths beside those fires. Life truly happened around the hearth of a home. Yeah. So protecting that hearth meant protecting the heart of the home. And I think that is an amazingly beautiful idea. Now, I don't think that I don't think we've completely lost that. We just call it a little different things now, that kind of thing. Maybe your kitchen table is your hearth because that's where everyone in your home gathers. Maybe it's your living room. Or maybe it's that one chair where everybody somehow ends up sitting. Every home has a center. And the more I personally learn about folk magic, the more I realize something else. It was not fancy. It was not expensive. It was not an aesthetic. It was practical. These people were not ordering these rare herbs from halfway around the world because they didn't even know they existed most of the time. They used what they had. The rosemary that was growing outside, the iron nails from the blacksmith down the street, ash from the fireplace, salt from the kitchen. Magic wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a lifestyle brand. It wasn't something they performed for other people. It was woven into everyday life. And that's one of the biggest lessons that I think that I've taken away from researching this is sometimes we convince ourselves that we need that perfect crystal. I am guilty of that. Or we need that perfect candle. Or we need the perfect moon phase to do this particular ritual or the perfect altar. Meanwhile, our ancestors were just standing around in the mud saying, I've got some rosemary, a rusted nail, I got about 15 minutes before I got to go milk the cow, and they just did it. And it's very grounding to think about it like that. Magic has never required perfection, but it has always required intention. Yeah. Now, over time, things began to change, and different magical traditions have been mixed together, and then books became available, and then modern witchcraft has evolved. And the idea of putting magical ingredients into a container hasn't disappeared, it has transformed. And instead of creating bottles to trap harmful magic, people have started creating jars to hold intentions, whether it be for protection or love or healing or prosperity, confidence, justice. And honestly, I think that's pretty beautiful too, you know? And I don't really see modern spell jars replacing witch bottles. I see them as descendants. The family resemblance between the two is still there. The purpose has just changed a little with time. Everything evolves, even witchcraft. It's kind of like your great great grandmother's recipe that was passed down, and now you make it just a little bit differently. Because maybe some weird ingredient that she had you don't have, so you've had to tweak it and make it yours. Maybe you added more garlic to it. I love garlic. You know, it's still connected to where it came from. It just became something new. And I think magic kind of works the same way. Traditions aren't frozen in time, they are living things. They grow, they adapt, they evolve, and they become part of the people that practice them. Yeah. Now, I do wonder sometimes if we've accidentally traded a little practicality for the aesthetics. I think we have. But not because pretty things are bad, because they're not. Believe me. I love pretty things. I have a lot of pretty things. I love my candles, my crystals, and my altar, and you already know that. But every once in a while, I have to ask myself, am I choosing this item because it's meaningful or because I feel like it might be photogenic? Because those are not always the same thing. Sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they don't. And that's okay. And I think it's healthy to ask ourselves those questions every now and then, not out of guilt, but out of curiosity. You know, Curiosity has always been one of the greatest tools that a witch can carry. Really and truly. That's how we learn. That's how I learn. So there is your little history lesson about spell jars and witch jars. And If this episode inspired you to make a spell jar, fabulous. I love it. If it inspires you to learn more about the history behind your practice, amazing. And if it inspired you to create your own modern version of a protective witch bottle, one that reflects your beliefs, your ethics, and your own practice, I think that is an amazing way to honor where these traditions came from without pretending that we're living in 16th century England. Because once again, magic has always evolved. We are just the next chapter in the story. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest surprises for me while doing all this research wasn't learning about that witch bottles were filled with like rusty nails or urine, although the urine, I knew urine had been used, but I didn't realize how much it had been used. I think the biggest surprise was realizing that ordinary people have always found a way to create hope. Whether they were right or wrong about what caused the hardship, they still wanted to protect their homes and their family and their children, their future. And that feels incredibly human. And I think that's something that we can all understand. Magic doesn't always begin with certainty. My dog, sometimes it begins with love or with hope or with someone quietly saying that I want the people I care about to be safe. And maybe that's what all these old jars or bottles were holding all along. Not just nails or herbs or weird ingredients. Maybe they were holding hope. And maybe that's kind of what some of our spell jars hold on to today. I don't know. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and let me kind of ramble on about this new little history obsession I've gotten. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to leave it a review or share it with a friend or come find me on Raven's Ramblings Facebook. We've got a whole page there or on the website, ravensramblings.com. And I'd love to hear if you've ever made a spell jar or if you even knew the history behind the witch bottles like we talked about today. And until next time, my dears, stay curious, stay wild, and stay witchy. Bye.